Old Caleb Whitmore stopped mid-sentence, his weathered hands trembling around the tin cup of coffee as he stared past his grandson toward the window. 700 armed men on horseback had surrounded their barn at midnight. It wasn't a rescue mission, it was a reckoning. His grandson Tommy dropped the whittling knife, the clatter echoing through the kitchen like gunfire. The boy's wide eyes reflected the same terror Caleb had seen in soldiers' faces 60 years ago at Antietam. Outside, the horses snorted and stamped, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the September air. Caleb's mind raced back to that night when everything changed, when a dying girl in his mother's quilt had brought judgment to their doorstep. The same quilt now folded carefully in the cedar chest upstairs, stained with blood and memories. "Get behind me, boy." His voice cracked with urgency and disbelief. Who were these men, and why had they come for a story buried decades deep? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that night of 700 riders, the Whitmore farm sat like a wounded animal in the Shenandoah Valley, bleeding money into the red Virginia clay. Spring rain drummed against the kitchen window where 14-year-old Caleb watched his father count coins for the third time that morning, Jeremiah's weathered fingers sorting pennies and nickels into pathetic little piles. $237, his father muttered, the numbers falling like stones into still water. "Bank wants $2,000 by Christmas or they take everything." The farm that had been in the Whitmore family for 3 generations would disappear faster than morning mist, swallowed by Reconstruction-era debt that crushed Southern families like autumn leaves. Caleb's mother had been the heart that held their world together, her laughter echoing through the barn during evening chores, her gentle hands tending scraped knees and wounded birds with equal tenderness. Typhoid had stolen her 2 winters ago, leaving behind a silence so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Since then, Jeremiah had grown distant as smoke, working from dawn to dusk but never quite meeting his son's eyes. The boy understood why. Every time his father looked at him, he saw Mary's soft brown eyes staring back, heard her voice in Caleb's careful way of speaking, witnessed her compassionate heart in how the boy couldn't pass a limping dog without stopping to help. Grief had a way of making love feel like betrayal, and Jeremiah carried both like stones in his chest. Their nearest neighbors, the Harrison family, had lost 2 sons at Gettysburg and sold out to carpetbaggers the previous fall. The Peterson place stood empty, weeds growing through the porch boards where children had once played. Throughout the valley, families were disappearing like sand through fingers, scattered by economic winds they couldn't control. Yet Caleb held on to something his father had lost, hope as stubborn as Virginia clay. In the barn loft, he kept his mother's cedar chest, filled with her quilts and the journal where she'd written her thoughts about kindness being the only currency that mattered. "The good Lord never gives you more than you can handle," she'd always said, though Caleb wondered if she'd known how much handling they'd have to do. The community itself reflected the fractured state of the nation. Former Confederate soldiers worked alongside Union veterans, their shared poverty creating an uneasy peace where old enemies now borrowed tools and shared harvests. At Ezra Matthews's church, men who'd once shot at each other now sat in adjacent pews, united by loss and the daily struggle of survival. Jeremiah never spoke of his war service, but Caleb had found the medals hidden beneath loose floorboards, medals that seemed too grand for a man who claimed he'd only done what was necessary. Sometimes, late at night, his father would wake screaming names Caleb didn't recognize, fighting battles that had ended years ago but somehow continued in dreams. The debt hanging over their heads felt like approaching thunder, promising a storm that would wash away everything they had left. The September morning dawned crisp and clear, with golden light filtering through the oak trees that bordered Willow Creek. Caleb had risen before his father, as had become his habit, to check the animal traps they'd set near the water. Every rabbit or squirrel they caught meant one more meal, one less coin spent at Henderson's General Store, where credit had long since dried up. The creek ran shallow this time of year, barely ankle-deep over smooth stones that clicked like marbles when disturbed. Caleb moved quietly through the cattails, his bare feet finding purchase on the muddy bank. The first two traps sat empty, their triggers untouched. Disappointment settled in his stomach like cold porridge, but he pressed on toward the third trap, set near a fallen log where animals often came to drink. That's when he saw her. At first, his mind couldn't process what lay crumpled beside the creek bank. A pile of fabric, perhaps, or a bundle of rags someone had discarded. But as he drew closer, the fabric resolved into a torn blue dress, and the bundle became a young woman, unconscious and barely breathing. Her dark hair spread across the muddy ground like spilled ink, and her skin held the waxy pallor of approaching death. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs as he knelt beside her. She couldn't be much older than 16, with delicate features that spoke of gentle upbringing rather than frontier hardship. Her dress, though torn and muddied, was made of fine cloth, the kind wealthy families bought from back east. But rope burns circled her wrists like ugly bracelets, and dried blood matted her hair where someone had struck her. "Miss?" he whispered, touching her shoulder gently. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds. For a moment, they focused on his face with desperate intensity, as if trying to communicate something vital. Her lips moved, forming soundless words before her consciousness slipped away again. Without hesitation, Caleb stripped off his own shirt and wrapped it around her shoulders, then gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, all sharp angles and fragile bones. As he lifted her, something crinkled in the pocket of her dress. Papers of some kind, though he didn't stop to investigate. The walk back to the farmhouse felt like crossing a continent. Every step jarred her unconscious form, and twice he had to stop and check that she was still breathing. His mind raced with questions and possibilities, none of them good. Young women didn't simply appear beside creeks in the middle of nowhere, beaten and left for dead. Someone had done this to her, and that someone might still be nearby. The kitchen door slammed behind him as he shouldered his way inside, calling for his father. Jeremiah emerged from the back room, his hair disheveled from sleep, but his military training kicked in the moment he saw what his son carried. "Upstairs," Jeremiah commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "Your mother's room. Put her on the bed." They climbed the narrow stairs in tense silence, Caleb's legs shaking from exertion and adrenaline. His mother's room had remained untouched since her death, a shrine to happier times that neither of them had the heart to disturb. The quilt his grandmother had sewn still covered the bed, its patches of blue and white forming intricate patterns that had comforted 3 generations of Whitmore women. As Caleb laid the unconscious girl on his mother's bed, Jeremiah fetched water and clean rags from the kitchen. Together they cleaned the blood from her wounds and checked for broken bones. She had clearly been beaten, but nothing seemed permanently damaged except for a deep gash on her scalp that would need careful tending. "She's got papers," Caleb said, producing the crumpled documents from her dress pocket. His father's face went white as he read them, some kind of identification papers, but with details that made no sense. The name listed was Sarah Elizabeth Adams, age 16, but the address was a boarding house in Richmond that had burned down 2 years ago. "Forgeries," Jeremiah muttered, but his voice carried an edge of something deeper than suspicion. Professional ones, too. This girl's running from something serious. As if summoned by their conversation, hoofbeats echoed from the main road, not the lazy clip-clop of a farm horse, but the urgent rhythm of riders moving with purpose. Jeremiah moved to the window, his body tense as a bowstring. "3 men," he reported quietly. Armed. They're stopping at every house, asking questions. Caleb looked down at the unconscious girl. Sarah, if that was even her real name. Her face, peaceful in sleep, showed traces of the terror she'd endured. Whatever she was running from had followed her here, and now his family was caught in the middle of something that could destroy them all. The riders were getting closer. The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather saddles. Jeremiah's hand instinctively moved to where his service revolver would have hung during the war, finding only empty air. He hadn't worn a weapon since coming home, but old habits died hard when danger approached. "Get her to the barn," he whispered urgently to Caleb. "The hayloft. There's a loose board behind the feed bins. She can hide there if needed." But before Caleb could move, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. This time, consciousness held. She gripped his wrist with surprising strength, her gray eyes wide with terror that seemed to reach into her very soul. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice hoarse as sandpaper. "Don't let them take me back, please." Tears streamed down her cheeks, carving clean tracks through the dirt and dried blood. "I'd rather die than go back to that place." "What place?" Jeremiah demanded, his military bearing taking over. "Who's after you, girl?" Before Sarah could answer, a sharp rap echoed through the house. The front door shook under heavy knuckles, and a voice called out with the false friendliness of authority accustomed to obedience. "Morning, folks. We're looking for a missing girl. Mind if we come in and ask a few questions?" Jeremiah exchanged a look with his son, a moment of understanding that would define their family's future. In that silent communication, the boy saw his father's war-hardened resolve emerge like steel beneath rust. Whatever had made Jeremiah Whitmore legendary among his fellow soldiers was awakening after years of peaceful dormancy. "Stay here," Jeremiah mouthed to Caleb, then called toward the door. "Just a minute. Let me make myself presentable." He descended the stairs with measured steps, each footfall buying precious seconds. Through the upstairs window, Caleb could see 3 riders waiting in their front yard. The leader sat his horse with military posture, his coat clean and well-tailored despite the frontier setting. Something about his cold eyes and thin smile made Caleb's skin crawl. Sarah struggled to sit up, her face pale as milk. "That's him," she breathed. "That's Colonel Blackwood. He's the one who—" Her voice broke, unable to continue. "Who what?" Caleb pressed gently. "He buys girls," she whispered, the words falling like stones into deep water. "Young women from families that can't protect them. Orphans mostly. He has a network, fake adoption agencies, corrupt officials. They told my guardian I was being sent to a good family in Boston." Her laugh held no humor, only bitter understanding. "Instead, I ended up in a warehouse in Richmond with 20 other girls." The conversation downstairs had begun, Jeremiah's voice steady but guarded. "Gentlemen, what can I do for you?" "We're looking for a young woman." Blackwood's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to instant compliance. "About 16, dark hair. She escaped from our custody 2 days ago. Dangerous individual, wanted for theft and assault." "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Jeremiah replied. "You're welcome to look around, but as you can see, it's just me and my boy here." Caleb's heart hammered as he helped Sarah to her feet. She swayed dangerously, but determination blazed in her storm-gray eyes. "There's something else," she whispered. "The papers in my dress. They're not just about me. Blackwood has a list of families. Families he's targeted because they have young daughters and no money to fight back." The implications hit Caleb like a physical blow. His own family was drowning in debt, vulnerable to any predator with official-looking papers and enough cash to buy corrupt cooperation. How many other families throughout the valley lived in similar desperation? Your family name is on that list, Sarah continued, watching understanding dawn on his face. That's why I came here. I overheard them planning. They know about your debt, about your father being a war veteran who keeps to himself. You were supposed to be next. Footsteps creaked on the stairs, heavy boots climbing with purpose. Jeremiah's voice called from below, tight with controlled anger. I told you, gentlemen, there's nothing to see up here. Nevertheless, Blackwood's cultured voice replied, we prefer to be thorough. Caleb made a decision that would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. He pulled his mother's patchwork quilt from the bed and wrapped it around Sarah's shoulders, then guided her toward the window that faced the back of the property. Can you climb? He whispered. She nodded, though her hands shook violently. The papers, she gasped. Hide them. If they find those names, Caleb grabbed the crumpled documents and stuffed them into his boot just as the bedroom door swung open. Colonel Blackwood filled the doorway, his pale blue eyes scanning the room with predatory intensity. Behind him stood Jeremiah, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Just checking for runaways, son, Blackwood said smoothly, but his gaze lingered on the rumpled bed, the basin of bloody water, the obvious signs that someone had been treated for injuries. You understand how it is. Young women these days, they get wild ideas about running off to make their fortunes. Yes, sir, Caleb replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Though I can't imagine why anyone would want to leave home. The colonel's thin smile never reached his eyes. Oh, you'd be surprised what makes people run, boy. Especially when they've stolen something that doesn't belong to them. The window behind Caleb stood open to the morning breeze, and somewhere in the distance a crow cawed, a sound that seemed to carry warning across the valley. Colonel Blackwood's inspection of the bedroom stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. His pale eyes catalogued every detail, the displaced quilt, the wash basin tinged pink with diluted blood, the way Caleb stood positioned near the open window. Nothing escaped his predatory attention, and his thin smile suggested he found the evidence more interesting than concerning. Quite a mess up here, he observed, running a gloved finger along the windowsill. Almost looks like someone's been tending to injuries. You haven't had any accidents lately, have you, son? Cut my hand on a broken jar yesterday, Caleb replied, holding up his palm to show a genuine scratch from earlier that week. Ma always said this room had the best light for doctoring. The mention of his deceased mother seemed to give Blackwood pause, not from sentiment but from calculation. Dead women told no tales, and grieving families attracted less scrutiny from neighbors. His smile widened as he processed this advantage. My condolences on your loss, he said with practiced sympathy. These are hard times for families without proper protection. The threat lurked beneath his words like a snake in tall grass. Jeremiah's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue. 3 armed men against 1 veteran and a boy were poor odds, especially with Sarah hiding somewhere on the property. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Blackwood and his men departed with promises to check back soon if their quarry remained at large. The moment their hoofbeats faded, Caleb raced to find Sarah. She had made it to the barn, collapsing behind a pile of hay bales where the morning shadows offered concealment. They're gone, he whispered, helping her to a more comfortable position. But they'll be back. Sarah's face had gone ash pale, and her hands shook as she pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. You don't understand, she said. Blackwood doesn't give up. Ever. He's been building his network for years, buying off judges, sheriff's deputies, even some federal marshals. Anyone who crosses him disappears. Over the next 3 days, the true scope of the danger became clear. Sarah's strength gradually returned as Caleb brought her food and water, but with it came the full horror of her story. She had been purchased, that was the only word for it, from a corrupt orphanage in Baltimore after her parents died in a factory fire. The adoption papers were legal forgeries, processed through agencies that existed solely to feed Blackwood's operation. 23 girls, she whispered during one of their conversations. That's how many were in the warehouse when I escaped, some as young as 13. They told us we were being trained for domestic service, but the men who visited— Her voice broke, unable to continue. Caleb's father became a different man during those 3 days. The distant, grief-stricken widower transformed into something harder and more focused. He cleaned his old service revolver and positioned it where he could reach it quickly. More importantly, he began reaching out to other veterans in the valley. Quiet conversations with men who had learned to read danger in the wind. On the second evening, Ezra Matthews arrived at their door. The elderly preacher moved slowly, his arthritis making each step deliberate, but his mind remained sharp as a blade. He listened to Sarah's story without interruption, his weathered face growing darker with each revelation. "I've heard whispers," he said when she finished. "Girls going missing from families that couldn't afford to search for them. Always the poorest folks, the ones with no voice to raise complaint." He turned to Jeremiah. "This is bigger than just your family, my friend. This touches the whole valley." Word spread through networks established during the war, veterans who had learned to communicate without drawing attention from authorities. Men began arriving at the Whitmore farm after dark, riding up the back trails that avoided the main roads. They came individually or in pairs, never in groups large enough to attract notice. Thomas Peterson, who had lost his farm to carpetbaggers but still owned a fine rifle. Marcus Webb, a former Buffalo soldier who had settled in the valley after his discharge. Even old Samuel Harrison, whose 2 sons lay buried at Gettysburg, made the journey despite his 70-year-old bones. Each man brought the same grim determination. They had lost too much already. Land, family, innocence, to stand by while predators stalked what remained of their community. The divisions that had once separated Union from Confederate, black from white, seemed meaningless in the face of this shared threat. "We're not vigilantes," Jeremiah told the gathering in his barn on the 3rd night. "We're protectors. There's a difference." Sarah had insisted on attending this meeting despite her weakness. She sat wrapped in the patchwork quilt, her gray eyes reflecting the lantern light as she shared intelligence that made the men's faces harden like stone. "He keeps records," she revealed. "Names, addresses, family situations. Anyone with daughters and debts gets marked for recruitment. Your valley isn't his first stop. He's been working his way south from Pennsylvania, taking advantage of Reconstruction chaos." The papers Caleb had hidden in his boot contained damning evidence. List after list of families, meticulously researched and categorized by vulnerability. The Whitmores were indeed marked, but so were the Hendersons, the newly arrived Murphy family, and at least a dozen others. 17 families, Marcus Webb counted grimly. 31 daughters between them. Lord have mercy. But it was Sarah's final revelation that transformed their defensive planning into something more urgent. "He's not working alone," she said. "There's going to be a gathering. Buyers from as far away as New Orleans and St. Louis, they're coming here, to the valley, in 4 days' time. He's promised them fresh merchandise." The magnitude of Blackwood's operation staggered them. This wasn't a small-time criminal preying on isolated families. This was organized evil with reach extending across state lines, protected by corruption that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. "We can't fight the whole system," Thomas Peterson said, his voice heavy with defeat. "No," Jeremiah replied, and something in his tone made every man in the barn straighten. "But we can fight him, here, now, on our ground." Caleb watched his father transform before his eyes. The hesitant, grief-stricken man who had barely functioned since his wife's death was disappearing, replaced by someone who commanded respect without demanding it. The other veterans responded to something they recognized, leadership forged in the crucible of war, but tempered by peace. "We're going to need help," Jeremiah continued. "More help than we can muster from this valley alone." "What kind of help?" Ezra asked. Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the lantern flame as if reading messages in its dance. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old secrets. "The kind that doesn't officially exist. The kind that appears when good people face impossible odds." He looked around the circle of weathered faces. "I'm going to send word to some old friends, men who understand that sometimes the law isn't enough." Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September night air. His father was talking about calling in debts that dated back to the war, favors owed by men who had survived because Jeremiah Whitmore had been willing to risk everything to save them. Outside the barn, night sounds carried on the wind. Somewhere in the darkness, danger approached with the certainty of dawn. But inside the circle of lantern light, something else was building. A determination that would not bend, forged by men who had already lost everything that could be taken from them except their honor. The battle lines were being drawn, and this time the stakes were measured not in territory or ideology, but in the lives of innocent children and the soul of their community. The dawn of the seventh day broke gray and ominous, with heavy clouds pressing down on the Shenandoah Valley like a shroud. Caleb woke to the sound of distant thunder, or what he hoped was thunder. The rolling rumble seemed to come from all directions, a steady rhythm that made the barn timbers creak and the horses stamp nervously in their stalls. Sarah sat by the window, fully dressed despite the early hour, her face pale but resolute. The past 3 days had transformed her from a broken victim into something harder, tempered by purpose. The papers hidden in Caleb's boot had become her obsession, not just evidence of Blackwood's crimes, but a roadmap to justice for every family marked for destruction. "They're coming," she said, without turning from the window. "I can feel it in the air." Caleb joined her at the window, squinting through the morning haze. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar rolling hills of home, dotted with oak groves and split-rail fences. Then movement caught his eye. A single rider on the eastern ridge, motionless as a statue, watching their farm, then another and another. Within minutes, the ridgelines began to fill with horsemen. They appeared like morning mist condensing into solid form, dozens, then hundreds of silent figures arranged in a vast semicircle that stretched from horizon to horizon. The sight defied comprehension. Where had so many men come from? How had they moved into position without making a sound? Jeremiah appeared at Caleb's shoulder, his service revolver strapped to his hip for the first time since the war ended. His face showed no surprise at the gathering army, only grim satisfaction. "Your friends?" Caleb asked. "Some of them," his father replied. "Word travels fast among men who know how to listen." The riders weren't uniform in appearance. No matching uniforms or banners marked them as belonging to any official organization. Some wore Union blue, others Confederate gray, many in civilian clothes that had seen hard use. What united them was something intangible, a shared bearing that spoke of battles fought and survived, of oaths taken and honored across the years. In the barn below, the local men who had gathered over the previous nights were stirring to wakefulness. Thomas Peterson emerged first, his rifle already in hand, followed by Marcus Webb and old Samuel Harrison. Each man's face reflected the same mixture of awe and determination as they witnessed the silent army taking position around their valley. "Mother of God," Peterson whispered. How many are there? Jeremiah studied the ridge lines with a veteran's eye for tactical assessment. 700, maybe more. Every man who ever owed me a debt, and every man they could trust to stand with them. The number staggered them. 700 veterans converging on a single Virginia valley to protect one teenage girl and the families marked for Blackwood's predation. It spoke to something larger than military camaraderie, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of America's bloodiest conflict, then tempered by the shared struggle of rebuilding their shattered nation. But even as hope swelled in Caleb's chest, a new sound reached their ears. This time there was no mistaking it for thunder. The steady drumbeat of hoofbeats approached from the south, where the main road wound through the valley. A column of riders, smaller than the force on the ridges but moving with military precision, advanced toward the Whitmore farm. At their head rode Colonel Blackwood, his uniform immaculate despite the early hour. Behind him came perhaps 50 men, too many to be simple bounty hunters, too well equipped to be common criminals. These were professional soldiers, or men who had been soldiers, now serving a different master for different rewards. Sarah gripped Caleb's arm with fingers like iron. "He brought his private army," she breathed. "Those are the men who guard his operations. They're not all evil. Some think they're serving justice, hunting escaped criminals. But others," she shuddered, "others enjoy the work too much." The two forces, Blackwood's column approaching from the south, the silent watchers holding the high ground, moved toward inevitable collision with the terrible certainty of fate. Between them sat the Whitmore farm, suddenly transformed from simple homestead into the focal point of something that felt larger than any one family's struggle. Jeremiah moved with calm efficiency, checking his weapon and adjusting the position of ammunition boxes the local men had stockpiled in the barn. But his movements carried an undercurrent of something Caleb had never seen before, not fear but a deep weariness that seemed to age him before their eyes. "I hoped it wouldn't come to this," he said quietly. "After the war, I swore I'd never lead men into battle again. Too many good boys died following my orders." "You're not leading them into battle," Sarah said, her voice stronger than it had been since her arrival. "You're leading them to prevent one. There's a difference." Outside, Blackwood's column had reached the farm's outer boundary. They arranged themselves in a disciplined line facing the barn, their weapons visible but not yet drawn. The colonel himself rode forward alone, stopping just outside effective rifle range, close enough to be heard, far enough to avoid immediate danger. "Mr. Whitmore," his cultured voice carried clearly in the morning air. "I believe we have business to discuss." Jeremiah stepped out of the barn, his hands empty but his bearing unmistakably military. Behind him, the local veterans spread out in defensive positions, while on the ridges above, 700 silent watchers observed the proceedings with the patience of men accustomed to long campaigns. "State your business, Colonel," Jeremiah called back. "I'm here to collect stolen property," Blackwood replied smoothly. "A young woman who escaped from legal custody. I have federal warrants for her arrest and for anyone harboring a federal fugitive." The papers he produced looked impressive from a distance. Official seals, elaborate signatures, the full weight of government authority. But Caleb remembered what Sarah had told them about Blackwood's network of corruption, his ability to produce legitimate-looking documents for illegitimate purposes. "I don't see any federal fugitives here," Jeremiah responded. "Just my family and some friends who came to visit." Blackwood's thin smile widened. "Perhaps you'd prefer to discuss this matter with federal marshals?" "I have 3 with me, all duly sworn and empowered to enforce the law." 3 men rode forward from his column, their badges glinting in the gray morning light. They looked official enough, but their eyes held the cold calculation of men who served the highest bidder rather than justice. The corruption had spread even deeper than anyone had imagined. "Impressive paperwork," called a new voice from the ridge above. All eyes turned upward as a single rider began descending from the eastern heights. He moved slowly, hands visible, making no threatening gestures, but something about his bearing commanded attention. As he drew closer, Caleb could see he was older than most of the watchers, perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair and scars that spoke of battles in distant places. "Major General William Sherman sends his regards, Colonel Blackwood," the rider announced as he reached speaking distance. "He's very interested in your recent activities." The effect on Blackwood was electric. His confident posture faltered, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his features. Sherman's name carried weight that transcended military hierarchy, weight that could crush careers and expose conspiracies that reached into the highest levels of power. "I don't know what you're implying," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost its assured tone. "I'm not implying anything," the rider replied calmly. "I'm stating facts. 3 weeks ago, federal investigators began looking into reports of organized trafficking operations using forged government documents. Your name appeared in several testimonies." Sarah stepped out of the barn, the patchwork quilt still wrapped around her shoulders like armor. Her appearance caused a visible stir among Blackwood's men, some recognizing her, others simply shocked by the defiance in her bearing. "Tell them about the warehouse in Richmond," she called out, her young voice carrying with startling clarity. "Tell them about the 23 girls you kept locked in chains. Tell them about the buyers who came to inspect us like livestock." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush stone. Even Blackwood's supporters seemed shaken by the naked accusation, by the ring of truth in Sarah's words. Some shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, perhaps realizing for the first time exactly what kind of operation they had been protecting. "She's a proven liar," Blackwood said, but his protestation sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Perhaps," the federal representative replied, "but she's not the only one talking. We have 7 other escapees in protective custody, all telling remarkably similar stories. Plus documentary evidence recovered from your Richmond facility." The trap was closing with the inexorable precision of clockwork. Blackwood's network of corruption, built over years of careful cultivation, was unraveling in the space of minutes. But cornered predators were often at their most dangerous, and Caleb could see desperation beginning to replace calculation in the colonel's pale eyes. On the ridges above, 700 veterans waited with the patience of men who had learned that battles were won by those who chose their moment carefully. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the valley and illuminating a confrontation that would determine not just Sarah's fate, but the future of every family Blackwood had marked for destruction. The climax was building like a summer storm, and everyone present could feel the electricity in the air. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with 700 veterans watching from the ridges as federal authority clashed with local corruption in the valley below. Then Blackwood made his fatal mistake. Instead of accepting the inevitable collapse of his operation, desperation drove him to one last gamble. "You want the girl so badly?" he snarled, his cultured mask finally slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "Take her, but not alive?" His hand dropped to his sidearm, but before he could clear leather, a rifle shot cracked from the barn. The bullet took his hat clean off his head, sending it spinning into the dust. Marcus Webb's voice carried from the barn's shadow. "Next one goes between your eyes, Colonel." Blackwood's men tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but found themselves staring down the barrels of a dozen rifles from the barn and surrounding buildings. The local veterans had positioned themselves with the tactical precision of men who had learned their trade in the bloodiest war America had ever fought. But it was what happened next that transformed the confrontation from standoff to rout. From the ridges above came a sound that raised goosebumps on every man's arms, the long, mournful note of a cavalry bugle, followed by another, then another, until the entire valley echoed with the haunting call to battle. 700 veterans began to move. They didn't charge down the hillsides like wild cavalry. Instead, they advanced with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers, their formation spreading to encircle Blackwood's force like a closing fist. Union blue mixed with Confederate gray, Buffalo soldiers rode alongside farm boys turned warriors. Immigrants who had fought for their adopted country stood shoulder to shoulder with men whose families had been here for generations. "Sweet Jesus," one of Blackwood's men whispered, his rifle trembling in his hands. "Where did they all come from?" The federal representative who had spoken for Sherman seemed as awed as anyone. "Word travels fast among men who honor their debts," he said quietly. "Jeremiah Whitmore saved more lives during the war than any single officer on either side. These men remember." Blackwood's force was outnumbered more than 10-1, surrounded by veterans who knew every inch of the terrain and commanded the high ground. But more damaging than the tactical situation was the moral collapse of his position. Several of his own men were lowering their weapons, unwilling to fire on fellow veterans who had answered a call for justice. "Stand down!" Blackwood screamed at his wavering troops. "I have federal authority here." "You have corruption and lies," Sarah called back, stepping forward with the patchwork quilt trailing behind her like a banner. "But these men have something you'll never understand: honor." Her words seemed to break whatever spell Blackwood's authority had held over his followers. One by one, his mercenaries began to surrender, dropping their weapons and raising their hands. The three corrupt federal marshals found themselves isolated, their badges suddenly worthless in the face of superior federal authority represented by Sherman's agent. But Blackwood himself wasn't finished. With the wild desperation of a cornered animal, he spurred his horse toward Sarah, a knife appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might reach her before anyone could intervene. That's when Jeremiah Whitmore reminded everyone why he had become a legend. Moving with speed that belied his years, Jeremiah intercepted Blackwood's charge. The two men collided with bone-jarring force, tumbling from their horses to crash into the dust of the farmyard. They rolled together in a tangle of limbs, the knife glinting dangerously between them. Caleb started forward to help his father, but Marcus Webb's iron grip held him back. "Let him finish it, boy. This is his fight to end." The struggle seemed to last forever, but probably took only seconds. When the dust settled, Jeremiah knelt over Blackwood's prone form, the knife in his own hand, its point touching the colonel's throat. Blood trickled from a cut on Jeremiah's cheek, but his eyes burned with the cold fire of absolute determination. "It's over," he said quietly. "Your network is broken, your men have surrendered, and federal investigators are already dismantling your operation. You can die here in the dirt, or you can face justice in a courtroom. Your choice." Blackwood's pale eyes darted around the circle of hard faces surrounding him, finding no sympathy, no escape route, no corrupt official willing to intervene on his behalf. The empire he had built on the suffering of innocent girls had crumbled in a single morning, brought down not by federal authority or superior firepower, but by something simpler and more powerful: good men who refused to let evil triumph. "I surrender," he whispered, the words seeming to drain the last of his defiance. As federal agents moved in to secure the prisoners, the 700 veterans on the ridges began to disperse as quietly as they had arrived. They had no desire for recognition or reward. The knowledge that justice had been served was payment enough for old debts honored. But the cost of victory was about to become clear, as tragedy waited in the wings to test everything they thought they had won. Victory's sweet taste turned bitter in moments. As the federal agents secured Blackwood in shackles and his remaining followers surrendered their weapons, a commotion erupted near the barn. Sarah, who had stood so bravely during the confrontation, suddenly collapsed to her knees, her face contorting with agony that went beyond physical pain. "The papers!" she gasped, clutching at her chest as if something vital was tearing loose inside her. "The list of families. It's not complete. There are others. Dozens of others." Marcus Webb was at her side instantly, his weathered hands gentle as he helped her to a sitting position. But even his experienced eye could see that something was terribly wrong. Sarah's skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and her breathing came in sharp, irregular gasps that spoke of internal injury far worse than anything they had suspected. "She's been hiding how badly she's hurt," Webb announced grimly. "That beating she took, something's bleeding inside." Dr. Henry Morrison, the valley's only physician, had arrived with the federal agents, expecting to treat minor injuries from the confrontation. But one look at Sarah's condition sent him into urgent action. His examination confirmed Webb's fears: internal bleeding, possibly from a ruptured spleen, complicated by infection that had been festering for days. "She needs surgery," Morrison declared. "Real surgery, in a proper hospital. Not something I can manage with what I have here." The nearest hospital was in Richmond, a full day's hard ride under the best conditions. Sarah's condition meant she might not survive half that journey. The irony was crushing. They had defeated Blackwood's network, saved the families on his list, and brought justice to a corrupt system, only to watch their victory turn to ash as the girl they had fought to protect slipped away before their eyes. Caleb knelt beside Sarah as doctor. Morrison worked, his young face etched with a desperation that made him look far older than his 14 years. "You can't die now," he whispered fiercely. "Not after everything we've been through, not after you've been so brave." Sarah's gray eyes found his, and for a moment clarity cut through the haze of pain. "The other families," she insisted weakly. "In my dress pocket, there's another list, hidden in the lining. Promise me you'll warn them." Jeremiah's hands shook as he carefully extracted the second set of papers from where Sarah had concealed them. His face went white as he read the names: families in neighboring counties, some as far away as North Carolina and Tennessee. The scope of Blackwood's operation had been even larger than they had imagined. 47 families, he announced to the gathered men. 83 daughters marked for targeting. The weight of that knowledge settled over them like a lead blanket. Their victory here had been crucial, but it was only the beginning. Blackwood's network had tentacles reaching across multiple states, and cutting off one head wouldn't kill the beast. "She's fading," Dr. Morrison said quietly, drawing Jeremiah aside. "I can try to stabilize her for transport, but honestly, I don't think she'll make it to Richmond." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. He had found Sarah dying by the creek, nursed her back to strength, watched her transform from victim to warrior, only to lose her now when safety seemed within reach. The unfairness of it burned in his chest like acid. As if summoned by their despair, one of the veterans from the ridges appeared at the barn door. He was older than most, with silver hair and surgeon's hands that spoke of another profession before the war. Dr. James Hutchinson had served as a field surgeon for the Army of the Potomac, performing miracles in battlefield conditions that would have challenged the finest civilian hospitals. "I might be able to help," he said simply, rolling up his sleeves. "I've done this surgery before, under worse conditions, but I'll need assistance, proper lighting, and something to use as an operating table." Hope flickered back to life in desperate hearts. The barn was quickly transformed into a makeshift surgical theater, with lanterns positioned to provide maximum light, and the old feed table scrubbed clean with carbolic acid. Martha Reynolds, who had emerged from hiding when the shooting stopped, proved to have nursing experience from tending wounded Confederate soldiers during the war. But even as Dr. Hutchinson prepared for surgery, another crisis was unfolding. A rider had arrived from the county seat, bearing news that chilled everyone who heard it. Judge William Ashford, the corrupt magistrate who had signed many of Blackwood's fraudulent warrants, had issued emergency orders for the arrest of Jeremiah Whitmore and all co-conspirators in the armed rebellion against federal authority. "Ashford's trying to save his own skin," the federal agent explained grimly. "He's claiming this whole thing was a Confederate plot to resist Reconstruction, that Blackwood was a legitimate federal officer performing his duty." The legal implications were staggering. Despite everything they had accomplished, despite the evidence of Blackwood's crimes, corrupt officials were already working to rewrite the narrative. If Ashford's version took hold, Jeremiah and the other veterans could face charges of treason, their families would lose everything, and Blackwood might yet escape justice. "They can't do this," Caleb said, his young voice cracking with outrage. "Everyone knows what really happened here." "Knowledge and legal proof are different things, son," Jeremiah replied wearily. "In the courts, it comes down to which story has more official backing." As Dr. Hutchinson worked over Sarah's still form, fighting to save her life one careful incision at a time, the men who had risked everything to protect her faced the possibility that their sacrifice might be meaningless. The system they had thought they could trust was proving as corrupt as the criminals they had fought. Thomas Peterson summed up their situation with bitter accuracy. "We won the battle and lost the war." Outside, the last of the 700 veterans were disappearing into the hills, returning to their homes and families, unaware that their heroic stand might be remembered as an act of treason. The federal agent, sympathetic to their cause, admitted he had limited authority to protect them from Judge Ashford's warrants. "Sherman's investigation will eventually clear you," he said, "but that could take months, and by then—" He didn't need to finish. By then, families would be destroyed, farms would be lost, and the men who had stood for justice would be branded as criminals. The corruption ran deeper than any of them had realized, with tentacles reaching into the highest levels of the legal system. Dr. Hutchinson emerged from his improvised surgery 3 hours later, exhausted but cautiously optimistic. "She'll live," he announced, "but she needs weeks of recovery, and any stress could reopen the internal injuries." The bitter irony was complete. They had saved Sarah's life just as their own futures crumbled around them. Victory and defeat intertwined so closely that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. As night fell over the Shenandoah Valley, the Whitmore farm stood like an island of uncertain hope in a sea of approaching darkness. The battle was won, but the war for justice was far from over. 3 days after Dr. Hutchinson's surgery saved Sarah's life, salvation arrived from the most unexpected source. A telegram reached the Whitmore farm through channels that bypassed local authorities entirely, carried by a Union veteran who had ridden hard from Washington. The message bore the seal of the War Department and changed everything in 13 carefully chosen words. "Federal investigation confirms trafficking network. All charges against Whitmore dismissed. Sherman." But the telegram was only the beginning. Within hours, a second rider arrived with news that spread through the valley like wildfire. Judge William Ashford had been arrested by federal marshals on charges of corruption, bribery, and conspiracy. The evidence against him included not only Blackwood's confession, extracted during intensive federal interrogation, but also financial records that traced bribes back to a network of corruption spanning 7 states. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more extensive and more horrifying than anyone had imagined. Blackwood's operation had been just one tentacle of a vast criminal enterprise that had been exploiting the chaos of Reconstruction for years. Corrupt officials in dozens of counties had been selling protection to human traffickers, using the federal government's authority to legitimize their crimes. Sarah, still weak from surgery but growing stronger each day under Martha Reynolds's careful nursing, provided the final pieces of evidence that federal investigators needed. The lists hidden in her dress contained not just names of targeted families, but detailed financial records showing payments to judges, sheriffs, and even some federal officials. Her memory, sharpened by weeks of careful observation during captivity, proved invaluable in identifying the full scope of the network. 47 federal indictments, announced Special Agent Harrison Pierce, Sherman's personal representative, as he read from an official dispatch, including 3 federal judges, 12 county sheriffs, and over 20 local magistrates. This investigation is going to clean house from Virginia to Louisiana. The vindication was complete, but it came with a price that weighed heavily on Jeremiah's conscience. During the 3 days of uncertainty, while corrupt warrants hung over their heads, 2 of the families on Blackwood's target list had lost daughters to the network's other operatives. The Murphy family's 16-year-old had vanished from a church social in the next county. The Henderson girl had been taken while walking to school, her books found scattered along a country road. "We saved Sarah," Jeremiah said quietly to his son as they stood together in the barn where it all began. "But we couldn't save them all." Caleb studied his father's weathered face, seeing the weight of command that had never really left him, even in civilian clothes. "Mama used to say that we can't save everyone, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to save the ones we can." Those words, spoken by a 14-year-old boy who had aged years in the span of a week, carried wisdom that resonated throughout the valley. The veterans who had answered Jeremiah's call were already organizing to continue the fight. Marcus Webb had proposed forming a permanent network, not vigilantes, but a communication system that could alert federal authorities to suspicious activities before more children disappeared. The financial salvation that accompanied their legal vindication came as the greatest surprise of all. Sarah's true identity, revealed only after federal protection was guaranteed, explained everything. She was not the daughter of Northern industrialists, as her forged papers had claimed, but the niece of Senator Harrison Adams of Massachusetts, one of the most powerful advocates for anti-trafficking legislation in Congress. "Uncle Harrison has been searching for me for 2 years," Sarah explained to the assembled group in the Whitmore parlor. "When my parents died, I was placed in what everyone thought was a reputable orphanage, but the director was selling children to Blackwood's network. I tried to escape twice before I succeeded." Senator Adams' gratitude took the form of immediate action. The $2,000 debt that had threatened to destroy the Whitmore farm was paid within a week, along with similar debts for every family in the valley that had supported the rescue effort. More importantly, his influence ensured that federal resources would be dedicated to dismantling the entire trafficking network. But perhaps the most profound change was in Jeremiah himself. The distant, grief-stricken widower, who had barely functioned since his wife's death, was gone, replaced by a man who had rediscovered his purpose. The 700 veterans who had answered his call began visiting regularly, not as an army, but as a brotherhood united by shared values and mutual respect. "I spent 2 years thinking I was finished," Jeremiah confided to Ezra Matthews as they sat on the front porch, watching Caleb teach Sarah to play checkers. "Thought the best of me died with Mary. Turns out I just needed to remember that some things are worth fighting for." Sarah's recovery progressed steadily under Dr. Morrison's care, supplemented by weekly visits from Dr. Hutchinson, who had taken a personal interest in her case. But her physical healing was matched by something deeper, a transformation from victim to advocate that inspired everyone who knew her story. "I want to testify at every trial," she announced one evening as the family gathered for supper. Every corrupt official, every trafficker, every person who enabled this network needs to hear from someone who survived it. Her determination worried those who cared about her. The stress of reliving traumatic experiences could potentially damage her fragile recovery. But Sarah's resolve proved unshakable, tempered by a strength that had been forged in the crucible of suffering, and refined by the knowledge that her words could prevent other children from enduring similar horrors. The trials began in the spring of 1877, conducted in federal courts that had been carefully vetted to ensure no corruption tainted the proceedings. Sarah's testimony, delivered with quiet dignity despite her youth, proved devastating to the defense claims that Blackwood's operation had been legitimate law enforcement. "They told us we were being trained for domestic service," she said from the witness stand, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. But the training consisted of learning to submit to any demand, no matter how degrading. The men who visited the warehouse didn't come to hire servants, they came to purchase slaves. The impact of her words extended far beyond the courtroom. Newspaper coverage of the trials sparked national outrage and led to congressional hearings that resulted in stronger federal legislation against human trafficking. Senator Adams used his niece's story to push through funding for federal agencies dedicated specifically to combating organized crime that crossed state lines. Back in the Shenandoah Valley, life gradually returned to a new normal, one that incorporated the lessons learned during those terrible days in September. The barn where Sarah had hidden became a gathering place for the veteran network that Marcus Webb had organized. Every month, former soldiers would arrive to share information about suspicious activities in their areas, creating an informal intelligence system that supplemented official law enforcement. The patchwork quilt that had covered Sarah during her darkest hours was carefully preserved, displayed in the Whitmore parlor as a reminder of how small acts of kindness could grow into something larger. Visitors to the farm often asked about it, prompting retellings of the story that had transformed their quiet valley into a symbol of resistance against organized evil. Caleb, no longer the uncertain boy who had discovered a dying girl by the creek, had grown into a young man whose moral compass had been tested and proven true. His experience of seeing good triumph over evil, despite overwhelming odds and systemic corruption, shaped his understanding of what it meant to be a citizen in a democracy where justice sometimes required ordinary people to take extraordinary stands. "Your mother would be proud," Jeremiah told his son one evening as they completed their chores. "She always said that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what's right even when you are afraid." Sarah, now legally adopted into the Adams family, but choosing to spend her summers with the Whitmores, had become like the daughter they had never had. Her presence filled the house with laughter and conversation, healing wounds that time alone could never have mended. The story that had begun with a boy's simple act of compassion, wrapping a dying stranger in his mother's quilt, had grown into something that touched thousands of lives across multiple states. 700 veterans had answered the call to protect one girl, but in saving her, they had exposed and destroyed a network that had victimized hundreds of others. As the sun set over the Shenandoah Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Whitmore farm stood as proof that sometimes, when good people refuse to look away from suffering, they can change the world. Sometimes life hands us moments that test everything we believe about family, courage, and doing what's right. Like 14-year-old Caleb Whitmore, many of us raised children during turbulent times. The Vietnam era, civil rights struggles, economic uncertainty, wondering if our values would hold when tested. We taught our kids to help others, to stand up for the vulnerable, to choose compassion over convenience. But did we ever imagine those lessons might one day require them to face down corruption and evil with nothing but moral courage and a worn family quilt. Jeremiah Whitmore spent years grieving his wife, feeling disconnected from his son, thinking his best days were behind him. Then crisis revealed that the bonds we forge through love and shared struggle can mobilize armies of good people when justice demands it. 700 veterans answered his call because they remembered what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. Today, as we watch our own children and grandchildren navigate a complex world, we can find hope in knowing that the values we planted in their hearts, kindness, integrity, standing up for the powerless, these seeds grow into movements that change everything. What family values from your generation do you see living on in your children or grandchildren? When have you witnessed small acts of kindness create unexpected ripple effects in your community? Share your stories below.